Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching, and it's time for part 9 of my How to Paint HeroQuest series, working on the gargoyle and the dread sorcerer. Now it's very similar to the rest of the HeroQuest series so far in that it's predominantly a contrast paint scheme to get the models on the table as fast as humanly possible. Now all the paints I use will be up in the top left of the screen and at the end of the video, but also check the description down below and drop a sub while you're there to check out more of the videos, that kind of thing. Now I am saying it's predominantly a contrast paint scheme, but I don't really like non-metallic metals done with contrast paint, so we are going to work on two metallics to start with, working on the kind of steel colour as you do with the gunmetal from Vallejo there, onto the axes and the swords. Now when you're working with metallics, it's always important to keep your paint within the line, so to speak, as you're working, but especially when you're going to be working with contrast paints afterwards. If you get any of this brass or any of the silver, onto the shaft of the weapon or onto his arms or whatever, as you're working, the contrast paint will not work as well over those areas. So really do try and keep the paint only where you want it to be. If you get it in the wrong area, clean your brush, wipe that paint off with some, of the wet brush, and then carry on. Because when we're working on contrast paints like we are here, onto the Wyldwood of the handle, the way contrast works is it relies on being able to flow around, and you'll see there it makes 2 or 3 colours kind of as it's moving across and settling into the detail. So excess paint or wrong paint in the wrong places will affect how it looks. Now this is a super quick scheme, and you see that the gargoyle and the sorcerer work on a second are 2 of the main villains of the set. And the gargoyles you typically see painted up just completely in stone with stone weapons and those things, and I wanted to do something a little bit different, so I'm kind of treating him like something living, like we've done with the heroes so far, or the characters so far. So with his weapons and things, making them look realistic, like they're not growing out to him, kind of being a part of him. So maybe not a colour scheme that a lot of people will like, but I wanted to do a little bit different just than doing him all in grey. Now what I'm doing when I'm coming to the horns here, you see, typically you would do horns and things in like a bone colour coming out of his head and his arms there, but I wanted to reflect the fact that this is a gargoyle, made out of stone or whatever, so I'm choosing the black over all of the horns, the bone areas, the kind of growth kind of out of his head, and I think that'll work really nicely to sort of point out that he's not a natural living creature. Like if this was, an orc with horns, you would do it in the kind of bone colour. So just something a little different that I thought would work well to make him stand out from the set, because this is the big bad guy that you're going to come across at the end of your HeroQuest adventure. And now we're on to the colour that I think most people would assume the gargoyle's going to be covered in, the basilicanum grey. A really good thorough coverage over the entire rest of the model that we haven't already covered with the wood and the leather strappings around, the axe and the sword. So this is working off the base as well. If you've watched the videos, you'll know that this is the colour that the stone part of the scenery has been done from, and it'll make him look like he's almost grown out of that dungeon. So a good coverage as you're going around. You don't want anything to pool up, but a good solid coverage all the way over, and then let that really dry. And the last bit of detail I'm putting on to the gargoyle is just taking a bit of that red, dropping it into his eyes. And then when that's thoroughly dried, we're going over with a Games Workshop Seraphim sepia wash over the entirety of the model, including the base. Again, you want a good layer on here so it'll settle into the gaps and cracks, but not so much that it starts pooling. So if you do see a little bit too much building up in like a big bubble or a lump or whatever, just take your brush and move it on to the rest of the model. And this will tie this model in to the rest of the range we've done so far if you've watched those other videos. And now we're on to the sorcerer. So I didn't paint these side by side. These were 2 separate evenings, well 3 separate evenings I actually believe, doing these 2 models, but you could absolutely paint them side by side, work on the brass on the gargoyle that you saw earlier, and then work on the brass on the sorcerer. My original intention was to do this as 2 separate videos, but I thought we'll roll it into one because it would have been a bit too much of a small video if I had just done one at once. So you see here working on the brass or the gold kind of colours on the sorcerer, and there's a lot to pick out. These are not super detailed models, but definitely more detail on the hero models than the standard, so just make sure you're picking up all the areas you want. See there the chains, the crown, he's got all the bangles around him before you move on. Same thing to say when you're putting those colours down, just be careful you stay within the lines. Now I'm using the magos purple, and if you've watched the scenery video you'll know that I use this on the sorcerer's table to make it look a bit sort of wizardly. It's an unusual contrast paint in that it's incredibly thin, so it did take me 2 to 3 layers to get the effect I was looking for. I didn't put it on super thick because that would have just clumped, but I did do 2 or 3 layers. As you go through here you'll see the tones in the background of this purple change because I was letting it dry and doing it again in between others, so just bear that one in mind. Now working on the black, I have to be super careful on this stage, because you see there I've drifted some of that black on top of that purple, and it's then just completely ruined that purple layer. So just be a little bit careful when you are doing this. If you do get this black onto any of the sections you've already done, get it off quickly, because it's very hard to cover it back up with either, you know, the purple later on. It won't cover that black very well, so just one to bear in mind. And then we're working on the very similar colours that we put on the gargoyle. Like I said before, you could do this alongside the gargoyle. I just chose not to at this particular time. So working on the wood of the staff, you could do something interesting here, I suppose, like a bone staff or something like that. But for me, it stood out as just being standard, you know, wooden wizard's staff. Now, I spoke before about I don't overly like non-metallic metal with contrasts. I do prefer using standard metal. But actually here, I kind of thought about doing the bronze or gold parts of this staff at the top and the bottom, but I thought actually the Nazdreg yellow gives an almost metallic effect, and this is what you would use for gold if you were doing non-metallic paint schemes. I thought it was just a little bit different from having the brass in multiple places, so it gives a slightly different tone to the top and bottom of his staff. Still looks a bit gold, but looks a little bit different, as though you make him, maybe he's casting a spell and there's something around it, or an aura or whatever. So although I said I don't like using non-metallic metals, works particularly well in this case, the same sort of time. Now working on normal flesh. Now the sorcerer's got like a weird kind of skull face, so we are putting the Guilliman flesh scheme down on his arms, a normal skin colour. When it comes to the face, I'm not putting it all over the face, I'm kind of just putting it into the neck, just on his forehead and his cheekbones, because this is a skeletal face he's got, and then moving on to the skeleton horde and putting that over the rest of his face. Now the Guilliman flesh would not have had time to dry, so it does pull some of that flesh colour across the skull as well, and gives a sort of interesting blended effect as it goes over there. Dropping onto the base with that basilicanum grey. That's the only time we use this on this model, which is fine, but it again blends the scenery in. I did do fairly plain bases, which I do talk about in my very first video why I did that. So if you wanted to do something fancier, you absolutely could. And then when it's thoroughly dry, it's the same process by putting that Games Workshop Seraphim sepia over the whole model. And that's it, that's the scheme done. You will see similarity between the two models. It's a little bit more effort into these than put into some of the basic orcs and mummies and things you've seen before, but it's a fairly basic model range. Total paint time for these two models over the course of maybe 3 evenings, maybe 3 hours max, and that's with a lot of drying time and that kind of stuff as well. So very fast models. I didn't really keep a track of how quickly they were done, but it was a couple of evenings in 1 week. So here's the finished gargoyle. He has been given a coat of varnish because these are gaming models, so there's a little bit of shine coming off of that, but I think it's a nice simple effect. I think some of the techniques in here I've definitely getting faster at as I'm working through these contrast paints. Enjoyable little scheme, and that is the bad guys for the HeroQuest set done. So the next videos we're working on the heroes, and the set will hopefully be complete fairly soon. Here's a list of the paints used, so you can check that out if you'd like. If you want to, check the rest of the channel, check Instagram, Facebook, that kind of stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on another video.